Welcome to my channel. I'm James, the Orthodox Landmarker. Why did I choose the handle, the Orthodox Landmarker? Originally, it was to correct the misrepresentations regarding the landmarkers of the 19th century. J.R. Graves, J.M. Pendleton, A.C. Dayton. What goes around today as landmark doctrine and what landmark Baptists today generally, in most cases, teach is not at all what they were teaching in the 19th century. The idea centers around authority. What do I mean by that? Well, authority is a big deal in many religious circles. Let's take Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox. Those institutions teach that you are saved only by becoming a member of their institutions, that salvation is in the church. Well, Baptists have drifted over the last 100 to 150 years into the idea that you have to have a mother church that grants authority to any new group of believers for those new believers to become a true church of Christ. And that's called Essential Mother-Daughter Authority, the acronym EMDA. And that's not at all what Baptists historically have taught. That's not what the landmarkers taught. What they taught and what Baptists have taught historically is the idea of direct authority. What's that? That's the idea that when a person is baptized scripturally by immersion, in that transaction, they receive all the authority that they need from Christ himself to associate, to congregate, to constitute themselves with other believers that have been scripturally baptized, and for that group to become a church. In fact, Jesus says in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 18, verse 20, says, where two or three are gathered together in my name, that is, in my authority, there am I in the midst. And you'll notice that in my name is the same formula when you're baptized. Baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And so authority comes directly from Christ. And this is a decentralized form of government. It's a simple form of government. Let's take Occam's razor. The simplest explanation oftentimes is the right one. Jesus says the most about church constitution there in that verse, and he says but little. And so believers can constitute themselves into a church. Now, churches oftentimes can become corrupt and start following false doctrines. And any group of people at any time can choose to withdraw from those churches and reconstitute themselves into a new church and go forward and to continue to follow the Lord. Okay, there is, it's just a very simple and it's a very decentralized form of government. And I believe that that's New Testament. And so churches can exist in any age, and the gates of hell can never prevail against that kind of a system. And so that's what I believe. So I was a member of a Baptist church, Landmark Baptist Church, for 30 plus years. And then one day I was reading in Gerald's Baptist Church Perpetuity. This is a standard history recommended by Landmark Baptists. And the good thing about Landmark Baptists is that they believe that the true churches of Christ can be found in every age, all the way back to Christ. And so oftentimes you'll see Landmark Baptists pointing to groups of people saying, well, there's a Baptist and that's us. And so they're very, very interested in confirming with factual data the existence of their particular group. And so there's nothing wrong with that. And so one day I was reading this history, and then on chapter number 1, I ran across this quote by J.R. Graves, the leader of the Landmark movement. Here he says this, quote, wherever there are 3 or more baptized members of a regular Baptist church, or churches covenanted together to hold and teach and are governed by the New Testament, there is a church of Christ, even though there was not a presbytery of ministers in 1,000 miles of them to organize them into a church. There is not the slightest need of a council of presbyters to organize a Baptist church. Then on page 2 of this chapter, which is only 2 pages or so long, Gerald himself says this: "Therefore, the talk about every link jingling in the succession chain from the banks of the Jordan to the present is ignorance or dust throwing. The only senses in which one Baptist church can succeed another are that the church leads men and women to Christ, then through its missionaries or ministers baptizes them, after which the baptized organize themselves into a Baptist church. All that Baptists mean by church succession or church perpetuity is this: there has never been a day since the organization of the first New Testament church in which there was no genuine church of the New Testament existing on earth." And so this is Baptist doctrine on church constitution historically. And there can be various nuances of that, but that's your basic idea. Now, when I brought this idea up to the brethren, how Baptists are famous for their potlucks, right? We were all sitting around having a potluck, and I said, "Hey guys, I ran across this quote by the leader of the Landmark movement, J.R. Graves himself. What do you guys think?" Well, they just about fell off their chair. They couldn't believe it, and they didn't believe it. And I said, "Hey, this is the leader of the Landmark Baptist movement, and we're Landmark Baptists." Well, they wouldn't have it. So that was pretty distressing, that I had been 30 years in this institution, and yet something so simple could have gotten away from us. And so I decided, well, I'm going to go back and I'm going to put everything that I have just assumed to be true that has come from the mouths of these teachers. I'm going to put everything under the microscope of the New Testament, and I'm going to look at the histories surrounding these things, and I'm going to see what the factual data is on this. In fact, one time I had a brother come to me and say, because we were Reformed Baptists and we were Calvinistic. And so this brother said, all the churches all the way back to Christ were all Calvinistic. That's what the apostles taught. That's what all legitimate Baptist churches have taught throughout the ages. And so I said, okay, well, hey, let's do that. But a lot of these arguments center around Reformation era. In fact, you'll hear, it seems like most of the time, everybody's focused on what's going on in the 1644 London Baptist Confession of Faith. That seems to be the manual. But that's 1600. The Reformation is 1600 years removed from Christ and the apostles. So let's just cut the middle guys out and let's just go back to the 2nd and 3rd century, the Ante-Nicene Fathers, 10-volume set. So I got me a 10-volume set that's all the Christian writings between the time of the apostles up into the Council of Nicaea, which is happening in 325 AD. This is about the time that the Roman Emperor Constantine comes along, legalizes Christianity in the Roman Empire, and from there you have the marriage of the church with the state, and you have a national religion. And from there, things begin to mutate and evolve into what we see as the Catholic Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church is all a part of this until they're split with the Roman Catholics. And so what did the Ante-Nicene Fathers teach? Because, the Ante-Nicene Fathers were oftentimes, they were independent. They weren't associated. They were oftentimes persecuted. And many of these Christian writers, Christian bishops, were put to death for their faith. Justin Martyr. Why is he called Justin Martyr? He's the first Christian apologist, and he was put to death. He was a martyr for Christ. What did they write? What did they believe? You're going to be perhaps shocked to see what these people believed in the second and third centuries after the apostles. Because Jude says that the faith was once delivered unto the saints. And so if that's the faith was delivered complete to the saints, so what did the next generation believe? That should be important to us. And so the other idea is that, the landmarkers of the 19th century, they didn't have the same access to resources that we have in our day. I want you to think about it. We live in the information age. I can be sitting on my couch, and I have often done this, and I have just a thought in my head. I wonder what so and so said in this document or in this history. I can Google it, and I can have a document, a history. I can have an ante-Nicene Father. I can have a confession of faith instantaneously appear, and I can be reading it. Well, the landmarkers of the 19th century, they didn't enjoy this luxury. I have to think or imagine that their resources were not readily available in all cases, that you had to secure certain works. You had to rely on other historians to do the work for you. And so they may have been relying on the works of others who were not so maybe honest about it. In fact, I've run across what I think can be some very misrepresented things put out by Baptist historians, and hopefully we'll get to take a look at it. But we live in the information age, and there's been a lot of really new things come about in the last 5 to 10 years that are absolutely remarkable, and they're pulling from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're pulling from ancient literature that can really give us some good perspective on what the Apostle Paul and the apostles themselves are actually teaching in the New Testament, and can straighten out our theology. And so I'm really excited to bring this information, because you know what? That's what I see the handle of the Orthodox Landmarker representing, a search for orthodoxy. So I would like to invite you to come along with me in our search for orthodoxy. Let's look at the data. Let's try to keep things factual based. I'll present it. You decide what you want to believe. No pressure. The last thing I'd like to say is, what is a Baptist? I am still a Baptist. Always will be a Baptist. And the things that I was taught, the things that I was taught that Baptists, that make a Baptist are this. Number one, freedom of conscience. We have the freedom to follow our conscience as the Lord leads us. That is a Baptist tenet. And we have the freedom to believe what we believe to be true, without the pressure of denominational pressures. Number two, Baptists believe in believer's baptism by immersion. Okay, that is a non-negotiable as a Baptist, as far as I see it. Therefore, paedobaptism, the baptism of infants, is a false teaching. Those institutions that have placed baptism before discipleship have actually given up their place as a legitimate Church of Christ, because they've brought unbelievers into their institutions, and they're baptizing unconscious infants. And then third, the independence of the local church. The idea that each church is independent, that each church can follow its conscience as far as the Lord's leadership, and that one church has no right to dictate to another church what they can and cannot believe. This keeps the entire idea of Christianity from actual complete corruption, because man is corrupt, let's face it. And these institutions that are run by one man, like the Pope, or just a group of elders running an entire denomination, can very, very easily become corrupt. But individual churches, now, if one, um, if you have 500 independent churches and one church goes into corruption, you still have 499 that are still sound. And not only that, but Jesus said, where two or three are gathered together in my name. A church doesn't have to be made up of 40 people or 400 people or 1,000 people to be a church. The lowest common denominators can be a church. 2 or 3 gathered together. That's a church. In the same sense that there's a church of 100 or 200 or 1,000. And so keep your eyes on this channel. We're going to look at some very, very important stuff that's come along that I think you're going to be excited about, because I'm excited about it, and I'm excited to bring it to you. So when you are watching videos going forward, I recommend, subscribe to our channel and like our videos if you think that they're a blessing to you. Looking forward to putting forth some stuff that's really, really exciting. God bless.